And here we go. Hi, this is Jake with Politics by Jake. As usual, I am your reporter and commentator and analyst for the situation with political matters and historical matters. And we're going to be talking about some of that stuff today. It's really interesting stuff. We're in a very serious situation here in the United States with autocracy and plutocracy taking over the country and controlling it. And it's very important that people are aware of what the truth is with regard to that. You have so much on the corrupt, controlled corporate media, which is right-wing, not left-wing, and we're going to talk about that actually at the end of the show. But we have so much of that that's going on. It's necessary for the voice of truth. So here I am, Jake, the voice of truth, and let's get into the show, and look forward to having you be here with me. So let's go. Now, I want to talk about something called the Stalin Rule, and these are rules for dealing with autocrats and their enablers, and thereby, got to give full credit here to Trygve Olsen of Viking Strategies. He developed these for his work deploying around the world, training activists and fighting for democracy in places like Belarus, Vilnius, Ukraine, and Georgia, and parts of Central Asia. And honestly, if we don't stop Trump, Olsen may well be training activists to restore democracy here. You know that here at Politics by Jake, we are against fascism. We have identified the movement that Trump is currently the head of as fascist in nature, certainly authoritarian, certainly reactionary. And Olsen has developed these rules, and they're great, and I wanted to share them with you. So 7 rules for dealing with autocrats and their enablers. Rule number 1, play the game you are in and not the game you wish or want to play. This means when one side is playing zero-sum, your liberal game, there is no win-win to be played. You will either win and democracy survives, or you will lose to autocratic forces. Rule number 2, always speak truth to power, because you never know the tipping point. You must confront the big lies of illiberal forces by speaking truth to their base of power. And the base of power, it's the people. There is a tipping point where your truth or the big lies prevail. Remember the statement that is credited to Hitler saying to his propaganda Joseph Goebbels when he was asked by Goebbels what it was that he should say to the people, and Hitler famously is reported to have said lies. Lies. Tell them lies. And I'm kind of, half mimicking Hitler here and the insanity that was Adolf Hitler. Lies, lies, tell them lies. The bigger the better. Sooner or later, something is bound to stick. And this is what I'm talking about with regard to this tipping point. There is a tipping point where either the big lies prevail or the truth prevails. And if we don't get the truth out there, and if we're not continually speaking the truth to power, and the power is the people. In a democracy, the power is in the people. But if we don't do that, Hitler's formula will prevail. It's very serious. Rule number 3, don't hand the autocrats battering rams with which to beat you. The game you are in, who you're fighting, isn't about policy or ideology. They will use what you say to divide you from your allies. You need these allies to win the battle for democracy. Rule number 4, understand that authoritarians must live in a truth-free present. The past presents truth about the big lies and the fears that the illiberal forces use. The future for autocratic forces only matters for maintaining power at the moment. They only care about keeping and gaining power. Rule number 5, practice zero-sum judo. Use their tactics against them. Big truths, marginalization. Make them dependent. Mock their disinformation. Divide and conquer their power structure. use their desire for the legitimacy of democracy against them. Rule number 6, the Stalin Rule. This is the Stalin Rule. Stand together with anyone who will join you to disturb or disrupt the illiberal structures. Even if you share nothing in common beyond a love of democracy and how much you loathe their politics in normal times, you fight side by side with them. Rule number 7, wake up every day thinking, where can the vertical power structure be exposed and destabilized? Each of us and all of us on Team Democracy must wake up every day and ask, what can I do to be on the side of restoring faith and confront the fear that they use? And I close this particular segment by stating, this is a fight we must win. As I've said to you before, Politics by Jake stands for this. This is a fight we must win. This is a fight we will win because more Americans stand for democracy than for an autocrat who is constantly dividing us, constantly tearing us up and down. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back again to talk to you about one of these little wrinkles that can cause a lot of problems and a lot of happiness for people who actually want to own a business or who have just started a business or who have actually created a business entity like a corporation or a limited liability company or who have been operating a business now for some time. It doesn't really matter. My guess is that each and every one of you people who has done something like that is going through this right now. You wanted asset protection. That's why you got your corporation. That's why you got your limited liability company. That's one of the reasons for starting a business. You wanted to grow wealth and you wanted to protect the wealth that you created. And you thought that a limited liability company or a corporation would be the way to do that. But did you know that just creating a corporation or a limited liability company does not guarantee that at all? Do you want to know if there's any way to fix that? Go to www.jakelaw.me. That's JAKELAW.me and watch my video where I talk about this very important thing, and then set up a time where we can have a phone conference or call me directly now at 573-454-1168 and let's talk about that and let's see if there are any solutions. Once again, that's www.jakelaw.me or 573-454-1168. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And now with some comments on polling, there's a relatively new poll from Main Street Research. It states Biden is 47 and Trump is 45. And this is from the past Thursday through Sunday. And it had previously been Trump 45, Biden 41. And that's a 6 points moving from Trump to Biden. But if you remember, I talked about this on this show. This is coming from the undecideds to Biden. And you remember that I've talked about, maybe you don't, but I'll refresh your memory. You remember how I talked about when a lot of people who were in the poll that was being taken, they realized that Nikki Haley had withdrawn from the race and that it was going to be Trump and Biden. These were the people who were undecided, and they were asked who they voted for or who they were going to vote for now that Haley was out of the race. And they switched their vote from Trump, or I should say Haley, to Biden. So all of this increase is coming from the undecideds. And once again, as I said to you before, this is what the Biden campaign had predicted would happen once Trump locked up the nomination. And I think that you will notice, and this has been going on, and this is really kind of a scandal. You'll notice that the polls that you're listening to on the media outlets are not talking about this, are they? And this is because, as I've observed, and this is why you should take issue with the polling that you hear, except from me. Because the stations that report these polls, they're often their own polls, or they're often the polls that they're paying money for, and they don't want the polls in question. So they have disparaged mainstream, and they rate it, if they talk about it at all, as the 85th best poll in the nation. But the funny thing is that the actual rating is it's 85 out of 277. So with all polling, there needs to be perspective. I appreciated Eric Holder's comments on a recent Bill Maher, where he stated that you have to have perspective on these things, and going by polls very early in the race and compared with how things will be in October or November is really quite a different thing. And so pay attention to the polls, look at all the different polls, understand the polls, but also have perspective on the polls, because we're a long ways from the election, and this is an attempt to sway the public and to persuade them that Trump is going to win, and that because that is the case, there is no point resisting. But on the other hand, the results of this mainstream poll could indicate that this might be the start of something big, and this has been happening recently. Okay, let's shift gears now and talk for a minute about the insurrection, the coup d'etat that attempted to overthrow the government of the United States on January 6th. And we're going to talk about one of the people that had something to do with that, and that is Ashley Babbitt. And I think I have a different point of view about Ashley Babbitt. Yes, she was an insurrectionist. Yes, she participated in the coup to overthrow the government of the United States. But listen to this and let me know what you think. I've talked to some people about this and made some comments and got some comments back, but listen to what I have to say and let me know what you think on this. And she was one of the people who was killed, and how Trump was notified when she was stopped, and how he didn't care, and how he used her. And it's always been my contention that the insurrectionists on January 6th were cowards. And I feel that they used her, and I want to just talk about that for a minute. I feel that I feel that this situation is the very same as the old 60s and 70s, and go with me on this, the very same as the old 60s and 70s commercial for Life cereal. Because as you recall in that, and if not, look it up, it's really kind of a classic commercial, that the kids did not want to eat the Life cereal because they were afraid it was good for you, because their mom had said it's good for you. And they, of course, in their childlike minds thought, well, if it's good for you, it can't taste very good. We don't want to eat it. And then they got their younger brother, whose name in the commercial was Mikey. And they said, let's get Mikey to do it because Mikey will try anything. And Mikey liked it. This same Mikey Life cereal commercial idea plays out in the tragic death of Ashley Babbitt, because Ashley Babbitt was sent down the hall by her fellow insurrectionists because they themselves were too cowardly to go down the hall, and they wanted to see what happened to her. Now, of course, one of the issues that we continue to have, because we're, waiting for it, is the whole presidential immunity issue. And I don't know how that's going to turn out. The court voted 9-0 against using the 14th Amendment, Section 3, exactly as it says it should be used. So anything is possible with this court, but with regard to the presidential immunity situation, and by the way, the presidential immunity situation is that Trump is arguing that basically the president can do anything. This hails back to the days of Richard Nixon, when Nixon famously said, if the president does it, it isn't a crime. This goes back to the days of the Roman Empire and Ulpian, who was an advisor to the emperor. This Ulpian, it's Domitius Ulpian, and he died in 228 Common Era, or AD, whichever you want to describe it as. And he was a very distinguished Roman jurist. He was a big guy. Ulpian was a big guy. He was a Praetorian prefect and chief advisor to the Emperor Alexander Severus. And it was he who basically, or I should say famously, enunciated the idea that what the emperor did was no crime. And this is why what Nixon said is so reminiscent of it, because he basically said the same thing. And this refers to an interview in which it was the aftermath of Nixon getting almost impeached and having to resign. And he actually said to the interviewer, David Frost, who was a very popular interviewer at the time, he was asked about the situation, and he said this. These were the words he said. When the president does it, it means that it is not illegal by definition. And this is the problem with Nixon, because so many things were left, because he resigned and he was let go. So many things were left unlitigated, and it was always inevitable. It was always a matter of time, just a matter of time before these things, something was going to happen again. The old saying after Watergate, for example, is that all the Republicans learned from Watergate was how to burn tapes. And the idea behind this was that they keep doing the same thing over and over again. So it was inevitable it was going to happen. And of course, we have Trump, who is a lawless, renegade demagogue, and he was a lawless president. He basically did whatever he wanted, and he had a coterie of people who were holding his coat while he did it, and were okay about it, which is why on another show I talk about the fact that some Americans are inimical to the idea of monarchy or a strongman, an authoritarian, a dear leader, a Führer leading them. But unfortunately, there are, and this speaks ill of democracy, but unfortunately, there are many who are not. And there are many who would like to see Trump. And we see, of course, Trump in the country having quite a few adherents and quite a few followers, in spite of all the things that he has done. And these are the things that are being litigated now, and that is what the presidential immunity are about, and those are occurring on April 25th, 2024. So those haven't happened yet, so I'm kind of dating the broadcast right now, but those haven't happened yet, but they're going to happen, because this is one of the things that needed to be litigated, that was first brought up by Domitius Ulpian in an ancient time, but has been resurrected with Nixon and was not decided, and it should have been decided. It should have been decided then. The court would have been more favorable than it is now. If you have a court that dismisses something so plain as Section 3 of the 14th Amendment 9-0, you have a real problem with the Supreme Court, a real problem. And that's just one of the problems. So this is not a favorable situation, but I think that, having said that, I continue to think that the best answer to the entire presidential immunity nonsense that is going on is to remind the justices that the moment they issue the ruling, assuming for the sake of argument that they do what they did on the 14th Amendment Section 3 case and issue this ridiculous, unsubstantiable ruling, I think the thing to do is to remind them that the moment they issued the ruling, they would be turning the president into an absolute and untouchable monarch. And that, because Joe Biden is the president right now, the moment they issued such a ruling, he could arrest any of them that he didn't like. He could arrest Trump. He could arrest any Trump supporter that he didn't like. Hold them all indefinitely, cancel the election, and as many of these kinds of things as he could make happen, he could always get away with. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and one of the things we do here at Twain is that we show people how to start a business, people who have started a business, and people who are in the middle of business operations, how to set things up in the very best way, because here at Twain Consulting, we feel that if you start right, it's easy to go right. So, okay, now all you people out there, have you ever tried to get a business credit line? If you did, what's one of the unpleasant things that you found out? Well, I'll tell you. You found out that the only way that you can get business business credit on your brand new corporation or your brand new limited liability company is if you personally guarantee each and every single loan, each and every single commercial credit line. Now, let me ask you this question. How did that make you feel? If you're like me, I would feel like they were giving with one hand and taking away with the other. If this bothers you, I encourage you to go to my website, www.jakelaw.me, where I talk about this and several other important products and services that can benefit really almost all people listening to the sound of my voice. And I also encourage you to call me at 573-454-1168 so we can talk about this, get mad about it together, and see if there isn't some sort of solution. That's www.jakelaw.me. That's JAKELAW.me, M-E. That's www.jakelaw.me, and the phone number is 573-454-1168. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. Now let's talk about Xi Jinping a little bit. He is, of course, the de facto emperor, president for life of China. And it's interesting, and when I say China, I mean mainland China. And it's interesting because Xi has done this in a way that others have come to power by basically getting the legislature, in this case of China, but the German legislature did this, the French legislature did this. In World War II, it literally voted itself out of existence, and this was the rise of Marshal Pétain. That's another story that we'll get into another time. But Hitler realized, of course, that armed violence alone was not the way to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish, which was a coup and an insurrection against the Weimar government. And so he did both of these things. He had his SA, his Sturmabteilung, brown shirts in the streets, and they were creating civil violence. They were beating up communists or anyone that they thought were communists. That was their thing. But he also realized that he had to do this. I'm speaking of Hitler now. In a legislative way, Mussolini did the same thing. As I said, Pétain of Vichy did the same thing. And Xi is doing the same thing as well. So let's talk about that. He's gotten himself, and Putin, let's talk about Putin. He has done the same way. We'll briefly touch upon Putin. Putin has basically made himself the emperor for life, and I'm going to talk about that more, and this ridiculous, nonsensical, you'll excuse the expression, election that just recently occurred in Russia. But let's get back to this. He's a de facto emperor. He is princely. He is a child of the official male clique. And when I say male, I don't mean the postal service in China. I mean M-A-L-E. Now, among other things, Xi is what is known as an irredentist. And that doesn't mean that he has studied in dental school. He is an irredentist. In other words, he wants his land back. Putin is the same way. Putin is more of a revanchist because Putin is out for revenge, and that's what revanchism is. But Xi is called an irredentist. In other words, he wants his land back. He's looking to get his land back to redeem the 100 years or so that China was abused, as he describes it, by Western powers, imperialist powers, as he describes it. And that would be mostly Europe and Britain. Now, I'm willing to allow that. The interesting thing is that the United States really was never involved in that. And so what he is looking at, as far as Ukraine is concerned, is that now Russia is distracted with Ukraine. And the far eastern territories would be very easy to go ahead and grab. He's been described as an evil demiurge, which is a kind of a godlike demon. And Xi has said, and this is so typical of these autocrats, these dictators, he has said words to the effect that the United States is trying to oppress us, and he warns them, that is us, that if they don't change their tune, that is our tune, there's going to be trouble. Dun, dun, dun. So conflict and confrontation, that's what he does. And what does that mean? China is a militaristic power. It is totalitarian. It is an autocracy. The Russian Federation, I said I would mention this briefly, it's the same. Putin is the same. This is the old Sino-Soviet bloc all over again. And, honestly, this is as bad now as it ever was under Mao and Stalin. In fact, it is more powerful than it had been under those two dictators. So in line with this, let's talk a little bit about Xi is actually in trouble. And this was actually inevitable. Here's a view of it. First of all, the world crisis is globalization. It's been going on for about 3 decades, and we have been living under a system of economic globalization. And I want to make clear that the operative word on this is economic. And this is what it is. It is a world economic system. It is based on neoliberalism, which is to say these old classical British economists like Mill, like Ricardo, and the rest of them, but with certain modern tendencies. It's based on laissez-faire, in other words, the free market, but it's a mockery of the free market because it is a free market that is not free for everybody. It's dominated by cartels. It's dominated by monopolies. It's dominated by duopolies. It's dominated by monopsonies and similar things. In other words, it is a mockery of the free market, and it is. This is just all a bunch of smelly nonsense and hoo-ha and falderall and horse hockey. Pardon me for swearing like that. I feel ashamed of myself now. We'll go on. It is, in fact, it's no free market at all, or at the best, you could say that it is a cruel and a bitter caricature of the free market, or what the free market is actually supposed to be. This contrivance has allowed, and when I say contrivance, I am referring once again to globalization. It's a contrivance. This has allowed the domination of the finance oligarchs over all other forces in society. These oligarchs have eclipsed the generals, they've eclipsed the priests, they've eclipsed even the demagogues, although I will say that very often the oligarchs rule through their own captive bootlicking demagogues. Of all the other groups that could lead society, this is the real power. The power is in the hands of these sociopathic financier oligarchs. In other words, the bankers. It has been an eclipse of humanity for the benefit of the bankers. It has been a time of deindustrialization here in the United States, with Wall Street sending 10,000 factories to the Chinese communists and the Oriental despotism that rules in Beijing since the coming of Xi. It has been a time of objective immiseration of the world, not so much because of that the empirical levels of production have fallen. That's it, although to be sure, in many areas they have. But the gap between what would be needed is the living standard that would be required to equip the rising generation to be able to function at the level that has already been attained by science, technology, and production. The gap between that level and the empirical level, which is to say that you would see that people would actually have in life pertaining to all kinds of things, like housing, like nutrition, like education, like healthcare. That gap has been yawning. It has been getting bigger and bigger. It's been growing wider and wider. And people are feeling it, which is one reason why a cultural populist, and I say this as an aside, one reason why a cultural populist like Trump can come along and be viewed as a savior, because people are feeling it. The gap is yawning. It's getting bigger and bigger. It's getting wider and wider. What this means is that you cannot have democracy and have the rule of Wall Street, which is appropriate to call, and I refer to the rule of Wall Street, primitive accumulation. It is, in other words, the looting of the population. And this, once again, is nothing new. That's why it's called primitive. It's been going on for a long time. It is the accumulated wealth, housing, family property, things like that, but also as it is manifested in the daily lives of tens of hundreds of millions are what are essentially helots. And helot is the Greek word, the ancient Greek word for slaves. So in other words, what we're looking at, and I realize this is kind of stark, I realize it's kind of outrageous, but so what? We are basically economic slaves. So in line with this though, let's talk about Xi. He's actually in trouble. And this was inevitable. And it's because of his autocracy. It's because of his need for control. Real property was part of the thing that fueled mainland China's growth since about 2007 or so. Many Chinese had their household wealth in real estate. They had it in real property. It was overall the biggest facilitator of mainland China's consumption. But because of COVID and the fact that China did not lift the COVID protocols until the end of 2022, and we all recall that, people were shut up in their apartments and in their houses for months on end, and it was just driving them nuts. This expected uptick in the economy, it just didn't happen. And now there's a crisis of confidence. China's ability to borrow, which is crucial for economic growth, is causing real problems. And there's a long-established relationship between deflation and reduced consumer spending. Consumers are going to be less likely to spend, and this is basically anywhere, not just China. Consumers are going to be less likely to spend if they think that there are going to be further price falls. And predictably, China has a real deflation problem. Fiscal revenue from housing fell 20%. Investment fell 10% last year. And in a government like China's, the question is going to be asked whether the government has the resources to stimulate growth. And China doesn't seem to have a plan B, so to speak, for resolving the problem. And while China has tried to convince foreign investors that China is still a good place to invest and that they can make money, Xi's desire for the Chinese Communist Party, and here we go with the autocracy thing again, here we go with the president for life, here we go with the emperor, here we go with the dictator. Xi's desire for the Chinese Communist Party to have total control over the country is seen to be the thing that is really doing a lot of damage. And the reason for this is that Xi has broken what's basically an unspoken compact with the people that you could call no politics, no problem. From 1973 to 2015, when the party was consolidating power, they basically left the average Chinese alone to do their business, to save, to invest. But because Xi has been so authoritarian, it has compromised economic development, which is exactly the kind of thing I base my premise in this segment on, which is that when you have an authoritarian, when you have an autocratic, tending towards, the fascist type of government that imposes austerity upon the people, it inevitably compromises economic development. The people get mad, and they start looking for a savior, so to speak. Just in the very same way as we look about us in these days, and we see the crazy behavior, because people do, they become unhinged. The crazy behavior, the maggots view that Donald Trump, in apotheotic terms, which means, apotheotic means elevated to the status of a god. That is, they look upon him as either a god or God's servant who is really going to save them economically. And that is really what a lot of this MAGA stuff is about. So, getting back to markets in general, and this applies to China as well, there always needs to be some discipline imposed upon quote-unquote free markets. But the idea that the people are looking at is that Xi has gone too far. And the thing is that this didn't have to happen. It wasn't inevitable, but this is exactly what has happened. Tensions with the West have increased. The situation with COVID has also increased tensions. But instead of reducing them, Xi tends to go with this same authoritarian approach, which is, by the way, his default mode. Authoritarianism and control, that's his default mode. And it's just making things worse. His forays into the South China Sea, which MacArthur once described as a peaceful lake, his territorial ambitions, his irredentism, wanting to get his lands back, the island of Formosa, which is Taiwan, his building of encroaching into the South China Sea and building, actually literally building, either building artificial islands or building up existing islands and then summarily claiming them for mainland China. His continual saber rattling about retaking Formosa, I told you about that. This all plays into this. This is all a part of this. And it's creating real problems for China because people see it. The situation inside is much worse than outsiders not familiar with these aspects tend to believe. State-owned enterprises, much more likely to get resources, including bank loans, and a variety of policies, while the private economy gets much shorter shrift and is what some have described as a truly desperate situation. And some observers have called this China's economic long COVID. There is this residual, or I should say residuum, of low energy and fearfulness that shows up in people saving more cash and in other liquid terms rather than taking risks in investing. And in durable goods or in longer term investments and responding less to stimulus packages from the government. Authoritarian regimes just don't do well sustaining growth. The austerity, the lack of confidence gets to the people, and they look, as I said, they become unhinged. Unhinged is a really great way to describe this. And they begin to look for other answers, other solutions, and these often take the role of a savior, so to speak. Another thing that plays into this is that the country is aging. Its population is shrinking, and it's shrinking fast. In 2015, for the first time in 60 years, which is quite a long time, China's population shrank. Long-range projections see 100 million less people by 2050, and get this, 400 million less people by 2075. And this is, never good news for an economy that wants to grow. This is just what I'm describing here is just an extremely rapid shrinkage of the population. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back again to talk to you about one of these little wrinkles that can cause a lot of problems and a lot of happiness for people who actually want to own a business or who have just started a business or who have actually created a business entity like a corporation or a limited liability company or who have been operating a business now for some time. It doesn't really matter. My guess is that each and every one of you people who has done something like that is going through this right now. You wanted asset protection. That's why you got your corporation. That's why you got your limited liability company. That's one of the reasons for starting a business. You wanted to grow wealth and you wanted to protect the wealth that you created. And you thought that a limited liability company or a corporation would be the way to do that. But did you know that just creating a corporation or a limited liability company does not guarantee that at all? Do you want to know if there's any way to fix that? Go to www.jakelaw.me. That's JAKELAW.me and watch my video where I talk about this very important thing, and then set up a time where we can have a phone conference or call me directly now at 573-454-1168 and let's talk about that and let's see if there are any solutions. Once again, that's www.jakelaw.me or 573-454-1168. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. Okay, here's a great story. It's reported by The Atlantic about the phony election in Russia. And I agree with this sentiment without even reading the article. And I just want to make some of my own observations and comments about this. In this election, this was phony, and I'm going to tell you why it was phony. There weren't any real candidates. There was no campaign. There were no debates, which, of course, is unsurprising because no issues are allowed to be debated because it's considered a sign of faithlessness in the government and or treason, and you get arrested and you get sent to the, modern-day gulags. The Russians did line up at the polling stations, but these were not actually polling stations. They were props, just like the proverbial Potemkin village. And the Potemkin village is the situation where when Catherine the Great was touring the provinces, Russia was basically, I don't want to say it was a slum, but it wasn't great looking. And so one of her ministers named Potemkin, created these villages, which they were like Hollywood sets. The facades looked great. And so when Catherine went through, everything looked great, but behind them was nothing. That's a Potemkin village, and it's named after the guy who created them. There wasn't any campaign. The Russians, they did line up. There were props. The polling stations were actually props. They were in a larger, elaborate piece of political theater. During the campaign, quote unquote, Alexei Navalny died under mysterious circumstances in a prison north of the Arctic Circle. You can be sure that he was killed by Putin. This is a tactic he has never, and I'm referring to Putin, never ever shied away from using against those who he believes to be his political opponents. Stalin actually, and Putin is a Stalinist. He's a follower of Stalin, and he knows the things that Stalin said. And one of the things that Stalin said once is he made a comment about this, and he said the way to handle people problem was just to eliminate the people. And his slogan was, no people, no problem. And Putin is definitely a Stalinist. Two Russian presidential candidates actually collected the requisite number of signatures to stand. Both of them said they avoided pay attention now to the stuff I'm talking about. Both of them said that they opposed the war in Ukraine. And surprise, surprise, both of them were removed from the ballot. There were three practically unknown people who were allowed to remain on the ballot, but they did not criticize Putin at all, not at all. They did not oppose him in any way. One of them actually said he hoped Putin would win. And in Russian-occupied Ukraine, the people were forced to vote at gunpoint. The joke about this, and this is because these fascist forces, both internationally and nationally, have paid moles in the Western news organizations, is that the Western media pretended this was actually an election. They cited exit polls, they interviewed voters, they had commentary on the results, as if this means anything in a country whose entire leadership openly lies about everything. And at this point, speaking of lies, let me talk about the peace that they made with Ukraine and how this was all a lie. Let me talk about the Budapest Memorandum. And when I talk about this, I'm referring to the Budapest Memorandum on security assurances, and it comprises three substantially identical political agreements. They were signed at a conference in Budapest, Hungary on December 5th, 1994, and it was to provide security assurances by its signatories relating to the accession of Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine to the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. The three memoranda were originally signed by three nuclear powers: Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and China and France gave somewhat weaker individual assurances in separate documents. The memoranda was signed in Patria Hall at the Budapest Convention Center. U.S. Ambassador Donald Blinken, among others, was in attendance. And this prohibited Russia, and we're now getting to the meat, this prohibited Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom from threatening or using military force or economic coercion against Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, except, and I'm quoting, except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. As a result of the other agreements and the memorandum between 1993 and 1996, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. This is one of the things you need to understand about the Russians. All they understand and all they respect is power. If they consider that you are weak, they will walk all over you. So what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is this: Russia lies. They lie about anything and they lie about everything. They violated the Budapest Memorandum and they concocted a story so that they could say they were acting in self-defense, which some of the dupes in the West have no more sense than to believe, because of the examples of Russian lying go back at least as far as Lenin, if not beyond, in order to disarm these countries. And why? Because all the Russians believe is force and power. And unless you can show them that you can stand up to them with either an equivalent or a superior force of power, they will walk all over you. And this is their intention. They concocted a story, as I said, that Ukraine was full of Nazis. They fed it as the Hitlerian big lie. And when I talk about the big lie, I'm referring to the somewhat infamous statement that is reported to have been made by Hitler to his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, when Goebbels asked what he should tell the people. And Hitler is reported to have said, lies, lies, tell them lies. The bigger, the better. Sooner or later, something is about to stick. So they did this. They said that Ukraine was full of Nazis. They fed it as a Hitlerian big lie to the Russian people. They attacked Ukraine on this lying pretext. They quashed protest at home by really just arresting anybody who dared open their mouths in the slightest way. That is what Russia did. And that is what Russia is. And I urge all those listening to the sound of my voice to internalize this. Even do your own research. Don't necessarily trust what Jake says. Do your own research into this in order to confirm or deny my words. But I'm telling you, that's what Russia is. Now, let me say a couple of things about Ronna McDaniels, and I'm going to segue into something about RFK Jr. One thing that they have in common, I believe, is that they're both anti-vaxxers. Ronna McDaniels she's a climate denier. Part of the point on Ronna McDaniels is that anyone who talks about the nature of the media as being liberal and on the left needs to understand that they really are not that. That's not the way it is. And that's actually the opposite. It's actually the opposite because of the fact that it's owned by billionaires, or if it's not owned by billionaires, it's owned by corporations. And that there are shareholders in these corporations, and that some of these owners have larger stakes than others, and the stations have to make a profit. And as a consequence, they are guided by the monetary aspect, and that influences how they report their news. And just to show you whose side these oligarchs and corporations are really on, there were a lot of corporations that said that after January 6th, they would no longer donate any monies to people who were election deniers. And there's a pretty big list of this. There's about 29 of them, at least 29. And I'm just going to read to you from one of these articles. In the wake of insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, 2021, in which a mob of far-right rioters attempted to violently disrupt Congress's certification of the 2020 Electoral College count. And I am saying as an aside here, this was an insurrection, it was a rebellion, it was a coup d'etat. And coup d'etat means a taking of the head. And who is the head? The American people are the head. And what these so-called rioters, which is, it's too easy a term for them, what these insurrectionists, what these rebellious insurrectionists and coup plotters try to do is to overthrow the United States government, not merely violently disrupt Congress's certification of the 2020 Electoral College count. But anyway, as I said, numerous corporations vowed publicly to stop donating to Republicans who supported the rioters' cause. However, a new report from a nonpartisan campaign finance research group called Open Secrets shows that corporations have been flooding the campaign war chests of Republican election deniers in Congress with more than $108 million donated since the insurrection. And I actually recommend that you get this article and you look at it. Once again, look online for something along the lines of, as far as search terms are concerned, of corporations donating to election deniers. That'll do it. That'll bring it up. So there's a lot of these, and it's complicated, and I can't get into it all, but I just want to give you an idea of this. AT&T donated $1.2 million to election deniers. UPS donated nearly $1 million, $926,000 to election deniers. Lockheed Martin, $870,000. Home Depot, $860,000. Charter Communications, and this is Time Warner, by the way, Time Warner Cable, 848,000. Boeing, 813,000. As an aside here, I might point out maybe that's why the doors don't work properly on Boeing planes, because the 800. All right, anyway. The leading donor of all corporations that own media is NBC. Comcast, that's NBC. People who tried to hire Ronna McDaniel, who is an election denier, $787,000. And then there's Cox, it was considerably further back with $357,000. These are the people who postured and said that they would no longer donate to the campaigns of election deniers. And here they are doing it. And this is just my point on this. Oligarchs own these media companies to a great extent. If they are not owned by oligarchs, they are owned by, and sometimes the oligarch may own not the entire company, but they may own a significant minority share, or they may own a majority share. And other shareholders may own, some shares, but the major owner is an oligarch. So basically, what's the bottom line here? Well, they lied. They postured, they lied, and now they have shown the truth of what it is that they are. And this goes to what that I'm always talking about, which again, oligarchs own these media organs. They do it for a reason. They do it so they can get their message out, or they can keep messages that they don't want getting out from getting out. And corporations who own them, they are beholden to their shareholders, and they follow the money. Who has the money? Comparatively speaking, it's not the people of the United States and of the world who have the money. It is these oligarchs who have the money, and these large corporations who have the money. So the next time you hear someone saying the liberal left-wing media, don't you believe it. This is absolutely, positively the most gross misdirection that there could be. And the example that I've just given you as far as how these companies are donating to election deniers, especially when they said they wouldn't do so, is an example of just how true that is. Now, I said I was going to do something on RFK Jr. Actually, I wanted to do something on the vaccine denier. And there's been a lot of confusion about the vaccinations and if they're legal or if they're not legal. And eventually I'll talk about that. But one of the things to understand is why RFK Jr. is in the race. RFK Jr. is in the race in order to draw votes away from Joe Biden. And one of the interesting things where if you look at this, you can kind of derive that this is the situation is when you look and see who Trump and RFK Jr.'s top donors are. And Trump and RFK Jr., their primary donor is Timothy Mellon. And he's also, as I said, backing Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s independent campaign. And Timothy Mellon is basically the scion, which kind of means the heir, to the Mellon Bank fortune. He was a top donor to Trump's 2020 campaign. Mellon has contributed so far $20 million to Kennedy's super PAC, which is American Values 2024, formerly known as the People's Pharma Movement. Rolling Stone talks about the fact that Robert Kennedy Jr., by far at least half of the 50 million that they report that he has raised comes from just two people, and one of them again is Timothy Mellon. He also backed Donald Trump, which I just reported to you, and he donated another 10 million to the pro-Kennedy super PAC, American Values 2024. There's some other people who have donated. Gavin DeBecker, who leads Kennedy's private security team, donated 5.5 million to American Values in October. And Kennedy is known for his anti-vaccine activism. And I don't think we're going to get to the other part of the vaccination controversy that some people like Aaron Rodgers and RFK Jr. have in common. And that was really a big problem during the COVID crisis, because people were basically trying to refute the idea that vaccines worked, and there was just an enormous amount of material that was generated with regard to this. But the point of this is that these are the people who are donating to these people, and they're doing it to draw votes away from Biden. That's the only reason. And whenever you look at the situation and you wonder who is on whose side, it's not the liberal left that's doing this. It's the reactionary, autocratic, and sometimes fascist right. Okay, and that's basically our show for this week, and we'll try to get to that vaccination thing and the legal aspect of it, and a little case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts, and we'll do that next week. Just ran out of time. Thanks very much for listening. Look forward to talking with you next week, and I hope you have a great week and that you join me again. Thanks. Bye-bye.